Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ciel Vaughan from Share Screen Africa. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining this talk today. We're really excited. So first of all, I'd love to welcome our primary audience for today's talk, which is the Botswana International University of Science and Technology and their fourth-year students. Thank you, Dr. Mazabedi, as well, for bringing the audience to us today, and everyone else for joining. And thank you as well to our fantastic speaker for today, Mauro Lourenço. Mauro is a geospatial ecologist and data analyst for the National Geographic Okavango Wilderness projects, working on research topics with freshwater ecosystems, wetlands, forest, fire, all sorts, using remotely sensed datasets and GIS systems. And he's worked throughout Southern Africa, including Lesotho, Angola, South Africa, and Botswana. And we're really, really excited and grateful that we've got Mauro here to give us a talk today. So without further ado, Mauro, please give us your talk. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks very much, Ciel. I appreciate the welcome and thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to present this afternoon. And yeah, just for context, that's the fourth-year class from the Botswana University of Science and Technology. Today, I will be sharing with you some of the papers that came out of my PhD. I graduated from Wits University end of 2022. I've been working for the Wildbird Trust and the Okavango Wilderness Project for a year and a bit now. And yes, I work mainly with GIS and remote sensing. A lot of maps will be shown today, and some videos and visual aids as well, infographics for you guys to enjoy. And yes, I'm very happy that some of the audience are current colleagues, former colleagues, former supervisors, and so on. So I really appreciate you all for joining on. I sent that out quite short notice today, so I really appreciate it. The content of my talk, which for those that know me would have seen this coming, but yeah, the title is Beyond Snow and Ice, Understanding Africa's Natural Water Towers. And that is my favorite map in the background there, but I'll speak about that a bit later. Okay, so just for the presentation overview, we'll go through some of these topics. What is a natural water tower in the context of African water towers? And then this concept of beyond snow and ice, specifically in the context of African water towers. Then the specific case study that we'll talk about today is the Angolan Highlands Water Tower, which we've abbreviated AHWT. And then we will go through the buffering mechanisms from the Angolan Highlands Water Tower, and we'll get into what those buffering mechanisms, what they are and what they actually mean. And then we'll focus on precipitation over the Angolan Highlands Water Tower and what that means for Okavango Delta inundation. Just a few of the media or conservation media outputs that came out of that publication. And then we will end off on landscape threats. So talking about fire, drought, land use, land cover change, and ending off on climate change, which Prof. Mazabedi asked for me to focus on in this talk. So we do have some slides dedicated to that. Okay, so I think we will have questions at the end, but please feel free to ask questions as you see them in the chat, or we can maybe write them down and save them for afterwards. So the first topic is what is a natural water tower? I've taken these definitions from a very important paper written by Immasil et al. This was part of a National Geographic's Perpetual Planet project. The title of the paper is Importance and Vulnerability of the World's Water Towers. I'm just going to emphasize the world's water towers there. It was published in Nature. It's a fantastic output, over 800 citations already, published at the end of 2019. And in their paper, they explain what a natural water tower is. So much like the man-made structures that you see with they're a bit faded out in the background. On top of buildings, these water towers supply to households in urban areas. We're really talking about natural water towers. So the term water tower is used to describe the water storage and supply at mountain ranges. So just referring to those higher places provide to sustain environmental and human water demands downstream. So I've highlighted the important words there: supply, storage, mountain ranges, and demand. So really a supply and demand thing here. Second point, compared to its downstream area, a water tower seasonally generates higher runoff from rain and delays the release of water by storing it in snow, glaciers, and lake reserves. So seasonality is a very important distinction here. And that really leads on to the third point, because of their buffering capacity. For instance, by glacial meltwater during a hot and dry season, water towers provide a relatively constant supply of water to downstream areas. So just like those man-made structures above buildings or a bigger reservoir, this water is intended to be supplied throughout the year. And this is what natural water towers do. So moving along to after the definition in this paper by Emersil et al., they included within their description, we consider only cryospheric meaning ice-dominated water tower or WTUs, water tower units, by imposing thresholds on satellite-derived snow-cover data and glacier inventory. So they're really looking for cryospheric data sets because of the buffering role of glaciers and snow. And that delayed supply of meltwater, which was a defining feature of water towers for them. And consequently, there are regions, for example, in Africa, as we can see in the map, which do contain mountain ranges, but because of their very relatively small ice reserves and snow reserves, they do not meet the water tower unit criteria. And so, unfortunately, this map that's shown as the first figure within this publication, very important publication, the area where we would expect water towers to have been in Africa is shown by the inset or the legend of the map. And even in Australia, these are the two driest continents on Earth without water towers, simply because of this cryospheric water tower unit threshold imposed as their definition. So we know that there are water towers in Africa, but this was a sort of a big question mark for African scientists. You can look at the National Geographic or Perpetual Planet Water Tower Index, which I am going to include here. All you need to do is scan this QR code with your phone. If you have a smartphone, you can go onto the QR code and just click onto the Chrome link, and it will take you to the Perpetual Planet Water Tower Index, where it's an interactive map of the data that's shown within this publication. Unfortunately, the Africa continent is still blank, but that's fine. Hopefully we'll be able to fill that in after many years of research. There'll be other times where I'll show you the QR code and I'll just give you a heads up. So I hope that was enough time for you guys to see it. If not, you can just simply Google Water Tower Index Perpetual Planet, it will come up. Okay, so as I've mentioned, yes, we do have African water towers. They were not identified in that previous study, but there is an output, a publication, a research report from the African Water Atlas, which was a multi-organization report published in 2010. So it's quite outdated at this stage already. And this map on the right-hand side is becoming quite important to me as and my colleagues as we move on in our work, trying to understand Africa's water towers. Essentially, the journal, the chapter in this document says African water towers, and they include this map, and then they include this quite brief description, and then they move on from there. So I will just read the description. They were identified by relative elevation, generally 200 to 800 meters above the surrounding area, so a high up place. Precipitation above 750 millimeters per year, and runoff above 250 millimeters per year. And then I think a quite important inclusion in this description is they were also selected for the contribution they make to water resources for populations beyond their delineated boundaries. So essentially they are including the river catchments or the basins in which there are a lot of people, and these water towers are supplying that water to those many, many people. So it's quite difficult to read the names, so I've ranked them in, I've digitized this image and created polygons, and I've ranked those in terms just in terms of area, so that we have some numbers attached to these blue polygons, which are labeled as water towers in Africa. Some of the biggest: Ethiopian, Albertine Rift, and Kenyan Highlands, they all contribute towards the Nile. We have the Angolan Plateau, which is the main content that we're going to speak about today, which contributes to the Okavango catchment. The Philian Arc also to the Zambezi. Here in South Africa, I'm in Joburg currently. The Lesotho Highlands provide water to South African population. Jos Plateau is the Niger Basin, Middle Atlas Range, and the Fata Dijon, East and West in West Africa, and then also a water tower in Madagascar. So very important figure, but very little written about how they came up with this. And our work is to try and unpack this a bit more and trying to find out a little bit more about water towers, because from the previous paper that I mentioned, the one by Emersil et al., which didn't include Africa, according to them, water towers affect 2 billion people on Earth, so 1/4 of the world's population directly, and that did not even include Africa. So these are very important regions that really require further work, further identification, and conservation. Okay, so I've expanded upon this, and I've explained this in another article. It was an article written by African Arguments. I wrote it beginning of this year, January 2024. Africa's life-sustaining water towers have been overlooked for too long. They changed the title. It was meant to be Africa's water towers beyond snow and ice. But you can have a look at that article by scanning, again, the QR code in red this time. And you're more than welcome to read about that, but I will explain what were the main outcomes following or within that article that I've written. So they are that the Water Atlas does highlight some of the very important rivers, the Blue and White Nile, the Congo River Basin, although the Congo River Basin, there's a lot of local rainfall that falls over the Congo. So in terms of a water tower, there's a lot of supply there already, so it might not be a very good example of a water tower, but definitely Okavango and the Nile are great examples of water towers where you've got a lot of rainfall on the Ethiopian, on the Angolan, and on the Kenyan highlands. And in the case of the Nile, it flows into the Sahara Desert and eventually out into the Nile Delta. And in the case of the Okavango catchment, it flows into a thermal basin, which is the Okavango Delta, which is essentially a desert. So these are very important examples of water towers doing what water towers are meant to do: supply water to an area that does not have as much water as the source region, and including other major rivers such as the Orange, Limpopo, and Niger, and the Zambezi. Another thing that comes out of the study is that African water towers are varied. For example, the Kenyan highlands are dominated by close canopy montane forests. They are wet. Also, the Lesotho highlands are cold and wet, but they lie above the tree line. And so we have quite a nice distinction here. We don't always have to have forests to have water towers, although it does receive high rainfall in comparison to low elevations. And again, just to reiterate that the Water Atlas is limited in its identification of water towers. It's rather simplistic. It does not cater for all the diverse range of ecosystems and freshwater environments across the African continent. And then it leaves out, for example, several critical water towers, including the Eastern Highlands of Zimbabwe, the Highlands of Cameroon, the Ghana-Togo Highlands, and the Central Highlands of Rwanda, Burundi, and the DRC, just to name a few. Just in continuing with that thread, according to that article, we all know this, that in many regions in Africa, people grapple and struggle with limited access to data and monitoring infrastructure. And unlike other parts of the world, like those water towers explained in the Emersil paper, the Amazon River, the Himalayan water tower, which is a water tower for the world, African water towers have not been really analyzed and looked at in detail, and some of them are not even recognized as water towers. And just to continue that, we really need to focus on these places. We've got a lot of challenges such as pollution, climate change, increasing water demand. So to start quantifying that and measuring that would be a first thing, let alone starting to respond to those challenges, which would be the next step. And then sort of take home from that article is that future research should acknowledge that the continent has a diversity of freshwater ecosystems, and our water towers are likely to go beyond these neat categories and broad-based definitions. And in the next decades, this is just pointing to Dr. Mazabede's request on climate change. Definitely a very important consideration is that climate change is going to affect drinking water for people, for agriculture, for industry, for ecosystems. And really in the African context, the amount of water really can decide whether someone is able to live and prosper or not. It's really that important, especially in these larger basins which rely on very important water towers. So climate change is a very important consideration. So this led on to the Angolan Highlands Water Tower publication. It was published with Professor Stefan Woodbourne and I. He's in the audience today. I'm very happy that he could join us today. Defining the Angolan Highlands Water Tower, a 40+ year precipitation budget for the headwater catchments of the Okavango Delta. So this was published again. There's the QR code if you'd like to see it, environmental monitoring and assessment. And this is open access. So you'll be able to access this paper quite easily. You just have to go and click on the QR code and you can get the paper. And just to point back to that, go back to that first map that I showed you, my favorite map, definitely my favorite map. This map was produced for Esri. For those of you that are familiar with GIS and remote sensing, Esri is really a world leader in that sort of technology. And so we produced this map to present at Esri, along with our main presentation at the Esri plenary conference in San Diego. And just to showcase all the different basins that the Angolan Highlands Water Tower contributes towards. So we've got basins that are more specific to Angola, the Kwanza River Basin that feeds the majority of the Angolan people that live in Luanda. Some of these southwestern basins that go into the Atlantic coast, the Etosha Basin, the Kubangu and Kwitu rivers that contribute to the Okavango catchment, the Kwando and Upper Zambezi that contribute to the Greater Zambezi catchment, and even the Kasai River Basin, which contributes to the Congo. You'll see later on that the Congo Basin, in terms of the water supply, because of the local rainfall in the Congo Basin, it is not as significant as the others, but it still is a source water region for the Congo Basin, which is the largest river basin in Africa. So I'm going to share again one more QR code, but this is for a video that explains the Angolan Highlands Water Tower. So moving on to the Angolan Highlands Water Tower, a lot of the concepts that were explained during that video, we will unpack them a bit further now as we go through the presentation. What I'm showing you here is just the MODIS time series. So MODIS NDVI, Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, time series through a calendar year. And really it's just to, on the African level, to show that the ITCZ is really having a strong influence on greenness and vegetation cover, but also the Angolan highlands throughout the year tends to stay greener, just symbol, as a symbol for this buffering capacity, these peatlands, these Biombo woodlands, these very important buffering mechanisms that allow for the Okavango Delta to get wet every single year and flood. So in terms of defining the highlands and the boundary for the Angolan Highlands Water Tower, what we did was we used the CHIRPS precipitation data set. It's started in 1981. I think we were publishing last year, so we had over 40 years of data. And we used the data set along the Quito and the Kubangu rivers, and we combined those two basins together. And we looked at the cumulative precipitation along those within those two basins according to latitude. So north-south, how much rainfall falls on those two basins. We simply identified where half of the rainfall falls north or south of a certain latitude. We extrapolated across that latitude and found that the elevation across that latitude is approximately 1,274 meters, and we used that contour line to indicate areas above would be the water tower and areas below would not be the water tower. And it works very nicely for the Quito and the Kubangu catchment, but as you've seen, it also works very, very nicely for this water tower in general and all the other basins that it supports. So it's really in this area here where the water tower exists, and this is how we were able to delineate and put a boundary for the Angolan Highlands Water Tower as the first publication to do so, other than the Angolan Plateau work that was shown in UNEP article of 2010. And this could change potentially in coming years, but the first publication was definitely an important milestone for us to put this place on the map. So I've mentioned briefly about the source lakes, Nyombo woodlands, peatlands, and the Kalahari sand. That was also mentioned briefly in the video itself. These are the buffering mechanisms. So not snow and ice, we're talking about something else. So these are the alternative to snow and ice mechanisms. So allowing for that flow to persist throughout the year, even during the dry season. So source lakes, this is Quito Source Lake. It's right at the headwater of the Quito River, and it's flanked by peatlands, and a lot of the rivers themselves are flanked by peatlands. There are some maps coming up for you to see that. And then adjacent to those peatlands is the Nyombo woodlands, and all of that is on top of Kalahari sand. So it's the combination of all these that allows for this water tower to provide water throughout the year. And if you've not heard of peatlands before, I did my PhD on these peatlands in Angolan Highlands. It's a very organic, rich soil that holds a lot of water. It does more than just hold water. It also stores carbon, because the organic material that's been accumulating year on year hasn't had a chance to decompose properly. It's partially decomposed because of the anoxic environment, or the oxygen deprived environment which peatlands grow in, and they accumulate every single year and actually are very important carbon storage. So not only important for water resources, but also be important for climate change and trying to an important carbon store. So globally, peatlands store more carbon than all the above ground carbon stored in forests. They're an exceptionally important carbon reservoir. And the thing about peatlands which makes them very important, or even more important, is that they can easily turn from a carbon sink into a carbon source. Once they get dried up, they're quite vulnerable to being burned, and all that carbon that's been locked away for thousands of years gets released back up into the atmosphere. So a very important ecosystem or wetland type or soil type to monitor and study. So again, just focusing on the precipitation budgets for this area, highlighting all the different catchments and countries that this water tower contributes water towards: DRC, Namibia, Zambia, Botswana, Zimbabwe, and Angola, obviously. The size of the catchment, 380,000 square kilometers. And then its contribution in terms of how much rainfall falls over the water tower area within that catchment and over the greater catchment. So for example, the Congo, it's a small amount simply because the Congo has a lot of rainfall, local rainfall. It's right by the tropics. But then in the case of the Quito and Kubangu, because of that delineation, more water tends to fall over the highlands portion than below it. And then just to indicate the seasonality, because we've spoken about buffering and the importance of seasonality for sustaining flows throughout the year, there is a period in the year where for 3 months there is no rainfall in the Angolan Highlands Water Tower. And it doesn't mean that the rivers dry up. Because of these buffering mechanisms, water continues to flow through because of those mechanisms that exist. So this is a distinction between rainfall on the water tower itself and rainfall below the water tower. So a lot more rainfall falls on the water tower than below it. Continuing with the precipitation, and what does that mean for the Okavango Delta and the amount of flooding? On the left-hand side, we compared rainfall within the Quito, the Kubangu, and the Quito-Kubangu catchments as a total, along with other studies that produced flood inundation estimates for the Okavango Delta. And the relationship is quite strong. So more rain in the water tower in these two catchments within the Angolan Highlands, the more the Okavango Delta will flood. So it's quite obvious, but it was good to see that this was the case. Dry years meant that there was less flood, and wet years meant that there was an increased amount of inundation. So that's was highlighted in the video. 2019 drought, very little rainfall, and the water tower itself had the smallest inundation. And then in 2011, a lot of rainfall, a very big flood. So an important figure to explain this very strong relationship between rainfall in the Angolan Highlands and the amount of flooding all the way downstream in the Okavango Delta. And then what we did was, because of the seasonality in the previous slide, you can see that the rainfall starts in September. The rainfall season starts every year in September and ends in August. We use that to try and understand which part of the rainfall is mostly correlated or more strongly correlated to the amount of flooding. So we included the entire rainfall season, which we can say that it's got the strongest correlations. And between the Quito and Kubangu catchments, the Quito had a slightly stronger correlation than the Kubangu. And we say that that's most likely because of the amount of peat that's within the Quito. And that rainfall is really being pushed and held up, by the peatlands. And when we have good rains within the Quito catchment, most likely the Okavango will flood very, very well. And then when we compare early season rainfall from September to December, or from January to April, the late rainfall season, which was mentioned in the video. So this early rain versus this late rain, we can say that the early rains are more strongly correlated than the late rains. So what it means is that if there's good early rains, we're likely to get a bigger flood. If there's not so great early rains, we're likely to get a smaller flood. And really what that comes down to is just the antecedent conditions, or the conditions that lead up to the flood itself. And essentially the early rains prepare the system for more rains afterwards. So if we have good rains in the early season, from right when this rainfall season starts, from September to December, we're likely to see a bigger flood. So we were able to present this all at the Esri User Conference. I've mentioned this earlier. Really a massive highlight for me personally to be able to go and present and be a part of this with Steve Boys, who's the founder of the Wildbird Trust and Okavango Wilderness Project, and Dr. Rainer van Brandes, who's the research director. We were able to present this explanation video, these results, along with all the other work that the Okavango project has been able to produce since being in the landscape in 2015. So I encourage you all to go and watch Dr. Steve Boys's presentation. It's on the Esri website. Again, I will share with you a QR code, a fantastic presentation for everyone to see. It's only 30 minutes, but it will really blow your socks off. I've watched it several times, and I encourage you all to go and see that. If the QR code doesn't work for you, just simply type Esri Dr. Steve Boys National Geographic Society, and you'll see it. You'll see his presentation come up. Okay, so just on this study, we had a lot of good conservation media come out and press releases. So this one from National Geographic Society explaining that this new study defines the boundary for the Angolan Highlands Water Tower, a critical step towards its conservation. We had one from Monga Bay and Ryan Truscott, who's a very important conservation journalist, new study pushes for protection of one of Africa's least understood treasures. Then from News 24, new study defines boundaries for Angolan Highlands Water Tower. And then from Mail and Guardian, Cherie Bega, first of its kind study, defines boundaries of the Angola's water tower. So very good outputs, very good to see that our work is carrying and going a long way into conservation media. And then a very important day for us as an organization was we were able to present this work to the president of Angola, President Mauro Lourenço. This is my colleague Vladimir Russo, that's Dr. Steve Boys, and that's Jill Tiffenthaler. She's the CEO of National Geographic, and they were able to present our work to the president of Angola, President João Lourenço. I'm not related to him, but we have the same surname. And subsequent to that meeting, we will hopefully be able to do the Kwanza River Basin this year, which I'm very excited about because it's got extensive peatland and forest. So I'm very excited to see how that transpires. So just to explain a little bit more about the organization and just to fill you in on that, to provide more detail, and going into the last parts of our talk today, just to expound on the Okavango Basin, our key the UNESCO protected area for the delta itself, and our two key conservation areas or project areas would be the OZ, which just simply stands for Okavango Zambezi Ramsar site, which is the green, and then the project area OZ Water Tower WT project area encompasses both the Okavango and the Zambezi basins. So I'm going to just be explaining what happens in those two areas. Firstly, in terms of Miombo, where are the Miombo woodlands, or where are the woodlands in general? I'm focusing mainly here on the river environments. That's where we do most of our work along the river. But just what I've explained before is that flanking these rivers is these extensive Miombo woodlands, and shown here by another MODIS project, dense and non-dense forest. And then the river where the drainage lines are depicted as non-forest and water within our two project areas. Again, very important that rainfall falling on these Kalahari sands seeping through the soil, it contributes towards the aquifer that contributes towards the water that flows into these rivers. So all of these are the buffering mechanisms that allows water to flow all year round. Again, the peatlands here, this is a map of the peatlands. What we've done here is just to include a probability score or maximum likelihood that there'll be peatlands here. So the highest scores of 80 to 100% are the lighter green or more vivid green. And then blank or no peatland is just the white. So if you just compare the two maps, the peatland doesn't occur in the forested areas. It occurs within where the drainage lines are, which is exactly what we've seen on the ground. And again, this is just a drone image of the Lungwevungu River, which I was fortunately able to go onto that expedition and also collect some additional peat samples, which we are preparing for a further publication. But for now, I did want to include this publication, which was the first output from my PhD. I'm very proud of this output. Myself, Professor Jennifer Fitchett, and Professor Stefan Woodbourne, my two PhD supervisors, were able to work on this publication, the first peatland map for the area, and really a landmark paper for me, published in Science of the Total Environment. Very, very happy about that. And also, there are some dates associated with those peatlands, which are included in a figure. Here, this is a schematic or a cross-section of the river itself. We have Miombo woodlands flanking the river valley environment. We have a distinct seep line where water is literally gushing out into the valley environment. And in some cases where that water gets ponded, you have peat forming. And we've dated, Professor Stefan Woodbourne has dated these cores to roughly 7,000 years old. So we link that to the African human period, where we have other peatlands in the Congo Basin, even in the Okavango Delta, which are more or less, which started developing 7 to 8,000 years ago. And then there's more modern peat that's forming right adjacent to the river. That's much younger and roughly 1,800, 1,700, 1,800 years old. Very interesting paper. And I did chat with our organizers that I will share. I will have a document there. All these papers and links will be contained. Just moving on to the threats. So we spoke about some of the mechanisms. Moving on to the threats. These images were taken on that Lungwevungu expedition. A massive fire that occurred while we were collecting peat samples. I was collecting peat samples right here, and it was burning. What we're seeing is that the fires in this landscape usually burn as surface fires, which is quite important, because if the fire was to penetrate into the peat layer itself, it would really sort of destroy the peat, releasing all that carbon, drying it out, and the peat would not function anymore as a peatland. So what we've seen so far is that the majority of the fires that occur in this area are actually surface fires and not smoldering combustion fires that penetrate into the soil layer. This to the right is just using the MODIS fire product, the amount of times an area burns, so per pixel, how often does that pixel burn from 2001 until 2020. And so a score of 17 to 20 just means that every single year that area is likely to burn. And you can see that burning is distinctly going along the drainage lines. So where the peatland is, where these grasslands are that facilitate peat growth, they are often burning every single year. We know that these peatlands are old and they've burnt in the past, but how much can they really burn before something like smoldering combustion or deep fires gets into them? Time will tell. So you're welcome to read more about these. In another paper, it was, I think, the third output from my PhD, again with the same authors, Fire Regime of Peatlands in the Angolan Highlands, if you would like to see that. So just some of the main findings coming out of that paper. In comparison, I'm just going to focus on Miombo woodland and peatland in comparison. For Miombo, there's a large proportion of Miombo woodland that doesn't burn, that stays moist, that isn't able to burn throughout any time during our time period of 20 years. And with regards to the peatland, it's the class that has the highest proportion of area that burns the most. It burns between 17 and 20 times over the last 20 years, meaning every single year it's burnt. And if you just look at when that burning happens, the peatland is quite similar to the other land use land cover classes, cultivated land, grassland classes, whereas the Miombo woodland tends to burn in September. So right at the end of the dry season, just before the rains start. And what is important here is that coming out of this paper is that fire is closely related to land use, land cover, and it's also closely related to people's habits and what people are doing in the landscape. So potentially people are burning to clear areas so they can cultivate, or also burning so that they could try and trap animals to catch them because they're hunting for food. These are areas that have they don't have supermarkets and those sorts of things. People really do live a subsistence life, and they're trying to catch their food so that they can eat, so they have protein in their diet. And this really relates to some of the other data sets that were shown in this paper. If you look here simply of how much area burned per year in that specific study area, in 2001 and 2002, just before independence and the end of the Civil War in Angola, we had very little burning in that region. Following that, in 2003, burning almost doubled or more than doubled, and it's had a very similar trend. During quite dry years, 2017 and 2019, burning was even greater. And then in 2020, during the COVID pandemic, burning subsided quite a lot. And we think that people were probably restricted in their movements, and they decided that they wouldn't burn as much. Maybe they used the resources that they had, and they didn't go out and burn as much area as in the past. So we think that there is a very strong relationship between fire land use cover and fire and people and their activities in the landscape. Again, another threat would be drought. This was the second output from my PhD, again, the same authors, published in Theoretical and Applied Climatology, just relating drought with vegetation response within this same Angolan Highlands area. Here again, we used the CHIRPS precipitation dataset and related that to two MODIS vegetation indices, the EVI, the Enhanced Vegetation Index, and the NDVI, the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index. And we looked at the Standard Precipitation Index or Standardized Precipitation Index, SPI, for multiple timescales, so 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, 24 months. What we're able to do is generate a common drought periods according to those timescales. And what we noticed was that droughts are becoming, the frequency of drought is becoming more, specifically in the last decade. But also there isn't a very strong relationship between drought and ENSO or El Nino. So it doesn't mean that whenever we have a drought, it's linked to El Nino, because there are some years where there was La Nina or ENSO neutral years. So it's not a direct relationship there, but in the last, for this study specifically, in the last years, the last drought was quite severe and it was associated with a very strong El Nino. Then moving on to the vegetation response, we grouped the vegetation into Miombo, Valley, and a total of highlands, so combined Miombo and Valley into highlands vegetation. And what we identified was that the system is very, very buffered. As soon as the rainfall starts again, the index scores bump up, and it's likely that this system has seen many countless numbers of fire and drought, and it's very buffered towards those threats, which we are labeling today as threats. But I think the real threat would be increased amount of people using the landscape, needing to cultivate or needing to burn for hunting or those sorts of things, or extracting water. I think just the human element might, instead of being these sort of balanced, homogeneous, and in a balanced state, we might have in the coming years more and more pressure on this landscape because of people. So we have identified other threats. I've looked at the land use land cover change for all of the river basins that come off of the Angolan Highlands Water Tower, and the main one that is affecting the Okavango Basin, or within the Okavango Basin, the Okavango Delta, is just a small section on the Okavango River, which is named Okavango in Namibia. In Botswana, it's named the Okavango. And then in Angola, it's named the Okavango River. So just this river that goes along the border with Namibia and Angola. And I've compared the 1992 land use land cover to the 2020, and I've grouped a lot of these land use land cover classes. This is from the European Space Agency Climate Change Initiative land cover product. And you can see that I'm just going to highlight 3 classes here. Most of the others stay the same. Agriculture increased by 18%. Forest cover or woodland, I grouped all the woodland classes together, decreased by 18%. And then settlement increased by 92%. So a lot of people making use of this river now, growing food along the river, extracting water from the river, and living right next to the river. So this is a satellite image of where the Quito and Okavango rivers join at the confluence. It's around about here within our map. And you can see that there is a lot of agricultural schemes, specifically on the southern side, on the Namibian side. So I'm just going to show you what those look like. Because we've looked at this river, we've gone down this river 3 times already. And we've noticed more and more river abstractions, more and more big center pivot agricultural schemes, a lot more people near the river, a lot more livestock near the river. And we're thinking that the region in general is becoming slightly drier and not as much water is available further away from the river, and people are coming closer and closer and closer, which is not to say that that's a bad thing. People need to make use of the water and live the lives that they need to live. But at the same time, more human pressure and agricultural pressure and livestock is not so good for water quality and water quantity. And just to give an indication of where that's happening, we've got an indication of where's most of the agriculture within that mapped area within Angola, Namibia, and Botswana, and most of the agricultural areas over Namibia. From what we've seen in the satellite imagery and on the ground, we think that this is perfectly correct, and this makes total sense. And the settlement as well, just within that block. On the Angolan side, very low income areas, not many settlements, not much agriculture happening, whereas on the Namibian side, a lot more. Okay, so just in the last, this is summing up now. We're going to speak about threats. And the last one is climate change. Dr. Mazabedi asked me to focus on this one specifically. I have a paper here from Carvalho et al., who looked at climate change scenarios for Angola. A lot of the climate change papers, there's not many that are specific to Angola, so I have two in this example. Some of them are more regional. But at least these two focus on the catchments that we've been talking about, the Quito and Kubangu catchments that relate to the Okavango Delta, and the Kwanda that also goes into the Zambezi catchment. So they looked at 4 different RCMs, or regional climate models. On the right-hand side are some of the outputs. Here is the mean anomaly of a minimum temperature compared to the average or the base mean. And they use 2 different RCPs, or representative concentration pathways. This is simply a greenhouse gas concentration. So what is that's used by the IPCC, if it's going to be a lot more greenhouse gases in the future or a lot less, depending on the scenarios that we go towards in the future. So low carbon or business as usual, you would have heard about these things before. And in all cases, for RCP 4.5 and RCP 8.5, the temperatures are likely to get warmer in Angola. And this is very consistent with regional studies for Southern Africa. Specifically, Southwest Africa are likely to get that area is likely to get warmer. So both for the minimum temperature and for the maximum temperature, there's some quite distressing figures here, specifically for the Kubangu catchment on this RCP 8.5. And then when it comes to, so climate change, we're always talking about precipitation. So we're always talking about temperature and then precipitation. In terms of precipitation, likely to get drier. So warmer and drier. That was the in a nutshell, response from this paper specifically for the Kubangu catchment, according to these separate RCPs. And then a more recent paper, so that previous paper was 2016. This one is 2023. Always good to use more updated research if you can. They did something very similar for Angola, Pinto et al. And here we have an output that's observed data. So observations that have been made already from several products on air temperature variability. So sorry, these are surface temperature variability in Angola. And you can see that they've all trended towards more positive or increased temperatures already above 2 standard deviations, above the period 1961 to 1990. Then they also used something like a GCP, but a SSP, a shared socioeconomic pathway scenario, something very similar. What is the scenario looking like for the future? And they compared it according to river basins, which is very, very appropriate for this talk. First of all, the mean temperature under RCP 4.5, SSP 245. Again, all trending towards increased temperature, no matter what the basin. Okay, when it comes to precipitation, it's slightly more variable. This is total rainfall. So the Okavango, there are some models which predicted to get slightly wetter, but the majority of them predicted to be slightly drier. And the same thing for water availability, although the water availability index for some scenarios is a bit all over the place, very big margins, and potentially we need to just refine these a bit more. But you're more than welcome to go and read this paper and have a look for yourself. So yes, that was the concluding part there is that most likely warmer and drier conditions expected for an already quite water-stressed area within Southern Africa. So thank you very much for your attention today. I really enjoyed speaking to you this afternoon. If there's any questions, I think this is the time. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Mauro, for that fascinating talk and for sharing some really groundbreaking research with us. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And that video was really amazing, definitely worthy of an award in my mind. So we will have a Q&A session now. If anyone has any questions, you're more than welcome to pop them in the chat and I can read them out for you. Alternatively, you could also use the function to raise your hand if you'd like to ask the question yourself. I am going to start off with our primary audience today and see if they have any questions first. Dr. Mazabedi, any questions on your end?
We have a question, so you may come forward. Yeah. So Dr. Bukut is going to open the questioning session from our side. Thanks.
Great.
Thank you, Dr. Mauro, for a nice presentation. My question is, you mentioned a number of threats, such as fire, climate change, drought, and so I just want to understand if, because we as Botswana, we are on the lower part of the Okavango Delta, and there's a lot happening up there. There's a table there that showed a lot of activities happening in the upstream part of the river. So while you are busy doing your modeling and all this fancy stuff, do you have any idea or some sort of prediction of how long can the Okavango Delta stay as it is now? Do we run a chance of maybe at some point not having the system that we have now, especially in the lower part of the Delta, considering, for instance, the human projections in terms of population growth and so forth? And the threat on the fire threat, is it predominantly anthropogenic or is it natural? And why did you specifically separate drought from climate change? Was there any reason? And you mentioned that drought, the system is very resilient from drought. So from drought, we may assume we don't have a threat there, right? From the presentation, the system is quite resilient. But with climate change, we probably don't know. So that's what I'm saying. Do we have some sort of projection to say, okay, we can have the lower system working for so many years, or maybe after this number of years, it is going to crash? Okay, thank you.
I see. No, that's a very nice question. Thank you for your question. I wouldn't want to alarm anyone and say that there's X amount of years before the system is unrecognizable from before. I really think that some of the things need to be more closely monitored. I think just because we've delineated the water tower doesn't mean that our work stops there. We need to continue to monitor it and understand this relationship between this headwaters and eventually where it lands up. But even in some cases, we could have local rainfall that could alleviate some of the problems. I think that what I was trying to get at is that, yes, the system is largely buffered. There's most likely been many droughts, countless fires. It's just the human element and the human impact, or potentially the implications that will be for people would become worse in the you know, it's hard to sometimes quantify that impact, but potentially yes, there are these threats, and the people that are living there can feel them. For the systems themselves, it's not to say that the delta itself will dry up or anything like that. I don't think, maybe with the dam or something like that, that would happen. But I was at a freshwater conference last week in Huambo, and there's no talk of dams. So none of that is on the cards. So all of the rivers that flow out of Angola into the Zambian into the Zambezi, into the Okavango, are all undammed, and I think they'll remain as such. So really only something catastrophic like that, which would make it into something unrecognizable, but really to put a number or this amount of years, I think it would be, you know, it would be alarmist, without, it wouldn't be necessary to be so alarmist, but yes, definitely, it's a bit of a, you know, it's brand new science, and it's a bit of a shame that it takes this long, but we can only get to where we are. So I think the real call is just to monitor these systems very, very closely, understand how they work, how they operate, what's making them work, and then identifying those threats and really quantifying those threats for the people that are there. You know, tourism industry in the Delta or in Botswana, it's very important for people's livelihoods, people living along the river in Namibia, and people using the water in Angola, those local communities. So I think for those people, that's what our work would be focused towards more. But yeah, putting a timeline on it, I really couldn't say. And then your other point where you mentioned drought and climate change. So yeah, specifically in this case, I was just looking for papers so that the students could continue to read up more about the system. So in the drought paper, we do discuss climate change, and it's very similar to what was discussed in that in those two papers, where we're expecting things to get warmer and drier into the future, and so adaptive capacity and resilience measures would be required by those people on the ground, and close monitoring. So flood monitoring system, drought monitoring systems, for example, and preparedness would be required in those cases. But they're not exclusive. They are combined.
Great, thank you so much for that answer, and thank you for that wonderful question. We have a hand up. Stefan, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question? That would be great. Thank you.
All right, let me just check. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
We got you, Stefan.
All right. Okay, I just want to expand a little bit on some of what Mauro said, because I really felt that the previous question was, it held some very important aspects that are very Botswana specific. You know, one of the things around the water tower is that it's always a buffer against seasonal water stress, but also it appears to buffer against droughts from the Botswana perspective. In other words, if you have longer term, more than one season with diminished rain, you still get some kind of buffering effect from the Angolan Highlands. But droughts are way more important than what happens in the rivers, because it reduces rainfall on the hinterland as well. And so the occurrence of drought, you know, you can't really say that Botswana is buffered from drought by the Angolan Highlands. Maybe the delta is a little bit buffered, but the hinterland isn't. And as soon as you have droughts, you will have rangeland failure, you have a shift into dependence on groundwater, for example. And this is actually one of the points that I want to raise, because Mauro has explained how the kind of Eurocentric perception of what is a water tower being related to snow and ice differs in Africa. But one of the things that we need to do, and Mauro and I have been talking about this, is to extend this concept from not just snow and ice, but water towers being these buffering systems, but also to start talking about groundwater towers. And in a country like Botswana, which is highly groundwater dependent, where does that water come from? How long is it stored? What are the dynamics around groundwater? Because in the end, the mechanisms, Mauro didn't really go into a great deal of detail about it, but groundwater is actually the mechanism that is driving the Angolan Highlands Water Tower. The peat is like a tap which controls the flow of the water, but it's all stored underground until it's released into the system. We're currently involved in a project reduced. Sorry, something happening in the background here. Sorry about that. So we're interested in working with BEUST on looking at how do we quantify groundwater towers and groundwater persistence as an extension of this water tower concept. Okay, sorry, I'll end there.
Yes, thank you, Stefan. And I think maybe I forgot to mention that some of the data that we do have, we've spoken with amongst each other with groundwater. It's you know, there's been some good work already, but I think that it's compared to the rivers and the drainage networks, it's a little bit less robust. So it would be good to focus more on the groundwater tables, as Stefan says. And thanks very much for joining today, Stefan. I really appreciate it.
Great. Yeah, thank you for that. And thank you for that little bit of explanation about groundwater, Stefan. That was fascinating. Really glad to hear that you guys might be linking up with BEUST sometime soon. Okay, I know that Dr. Lourenço has to run in a bit, but maybe we have time for one more question if there are any questions from BEUST.
Hello, my name is Gesa. Well, I'm not really sure about the question, but I'm asking just so that I can see my curiosity. So, I don't know if I heard clearly, but I heard Sam mentioning about how the water towers in Africa have been not been recognized that much. So I think I also heard how he was thinking about how the water towers outside Africa are mostly located in ice. Yeah. So what I want to ask is how the water towers in Africa, you gave an example of the one in Angola. I wanted to know how they're able to distribute that amount of water. I want to know if they have any specific trades, special trades. I don't know if I want to know if they have any special trades compared to the ones that are outside Africa.
Yeah,
that are advantages in some sense. I don't know.
Thank you very much for your question. Yeah, that's a really important question. A good question that I ask myself often is trying to understand what are the characteristics that make certain water towers work in the way they do. So is it always the peatland, woodland, Kalahari sand, groundwater, recharge, source lake combination, or is it not? So I spoke about that very briefly, and just to get that going, that conversation going about the Kenyan highlands versus the Lesotho highlands. Lesotho highlands also have peatlands, but they're above the tree line, and in Kenya they're a closed canopy forest. So really, that's the work that myself and Stefan and others from our organization are trying to get a grip over, understanding what those mechanisms are, and are there commonalities, are there differences, and where are the commonalities, where are the differences. It's really an important step in the next few steps that we have. This was a culmination of a lot of work over many years since 2015 when this project started for the Angolan Highlands Water Tower. I think we can move a bit faster going forward, but yes, the idea is to go and extrapolate what we've done in this basin, in these basins, in this water tower to all the others. One at a time. I think that there might be some uniqueness and some of the same. But yes, this is a very important question. This is something that we want to look into for sure. Thank you very much for your question.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. I'm really interested to learn a little bit more about the Kenyan Highland Water Towers because that's where I'm currently based. So I guess I'm a little bit biased on that front. Okay, Dr. Lourenço, I know that you have to run. We've taken up a lot of your precious time and we're very, very grateful for that. Thank you so much once again for taking the time to give us this presentation. As you said, a culmination from a lot of work over a long period of time, which we know does happen as scientists, but we're grateful nonetheless. And I think these kind of the discoveries that you've made are going to be really important for the conservation, you know, and maintenance of these water towers going forward. So from us at ShareScreen, thank you so much. And I'm sure Dr. Mazabedi echoes our thoughts. And thank you so much as well to our online audience for joining this afternoon. That is essentially the end of the presentation. I'm going to stay on with our primary audience as we've got some activities planned for the students. But if the rest of you are happy to fall out, thank you so much for joining and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much, Dr. Lourenço.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, guys. Been a pleasure. Cheers.